Russia's withdrawal from Syria has been a significant setback for Vladimir Putin, despite his public insistence that Moscow did not suffer a defeat. In his annual press conference, Putin adamantly denied that Russia had failed in Syria, instead asserting that all intended objectives had been accomplished. He downplayed Moscow's role in Syria's downfall, dismissing claims that Russia's intervention had ultimately been futile. The retreat, now being framed as a calculated exit, comes after nearly a decade of Russia spending more than $4 billion annually in Syria and enduring substantial casualties. However, despite this extensive effort, Assad's regime ultimately collapsed in December, with the rebel faction Hayat Tahrir al-Sham seizing control in a matter of days, undoing years of Russian-backed resistance. Now, Putin is scrambling to safeguard Russia's military bases in Syria while simultaneously trying to uphold an image of strong leadership at home, an effort that appears to be faltering on both fronts. Putin remains steadfast in his narrative of victory despite the situation on the ground. When questioned about the supposed failure in Syria, he firmly refuted the claim, stating that Russia's intervention was primarily aimed at preventing the establishment of a terrorist enclave and insisting that the mission had achieved its objectives. He has repeatedly reiterated this stance, claiming victory while much of the world sees Russia's intervention as a costly failure. To understand the extent of Russia's involvement, its claims of success, and why Putin continues to maintain this narrative despite the reality, it is necessary to examine the origins of the Syrian civil war and the factors that led Russia to intervene. The Syrian conflict erupted in 2011 as part of the broader wave of protests and uprisings known as the Arab Spring. This movement saw people across various Arab nations demand greater political freedoms and an end to years of authoritarian rule. In Syria, the initial demonstrations were largely peaceful, with citizens calling for democratic reforms and an end to government corruption. However, the Assad regime, led by President Bashar al-Assad, son of Hafez al-Assad, who ruled from 1971 to 2000, responded with brutal crackdowns, escalating tensions and pushing the country into a full-scale civil war. The conflict soon became a complex multi-sided struggle, with numerous factions fighting for control. On one side was Assad's government, backed by Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah. On the other, there was a mix of opposition groups, ranging from pro-democracy rebels to Islamist factions, each with their own ideological motivations. Additionally, extremist groups like ISIS took advantage of the chaos to seize territory, further complicating the situation. As the war dragged on, Syria's humanitarian crisis worsened, with millions of people displaced and the country's infrastructure devastated. It was under these dire circumstances that Russia decided to fully immerse itself in the conflict. Russia's intervention in Syria did not come as a surprise, given its long-standing ties with the country. Syria had been one of Russia's key allies in the Middle East since the Cold War, when the Soviet Union supported it as part of its broader strategy to counter Western influence. By 2015, Assad's regime was on the verge of collapse, with opposition forces gaining ground and ISIS controlling large swaths of the country. With the situation reaching a critical point, Putin made the decision to send Russian forces to Syria, a move that carried significant risks. Several factors motivated Russia's involvement in the war. One of the primary reasons was geopolitics. Supporting Assad allowed Russia to maintain its influence in the Middle East and protect its strategic assets, particularly its only Mediterranean naval facility, the Tartus naval base. This base had been crucial for Russia's military operations in the region since the Cold War, and maintaining control over it was a key priority. Over the years, Russia expanded its military footprint in Syria, gaining access to the Maymen airbase and reinforcing its presence to ensure a long-term strategic foothold in the region. Beyond military strategy, Russia also framed its intervention as a fight against terrorism, specifically targeting ISIS. By presenting itself as a key player in the global war on terror, Russia sought to justify its actions both domestically and internationally. This narrative resonated with some, allowing Moscow to position itself as an indispensable actor in Middle Eastern geopolitics. Additionally, intervening in Syria allowed Russia to challenge Western influence in the region. By supporting Assad, Moscow positioned itself as a power broker, countering US and European efforts to back opposition forces. This move also signaled to other allied governments that Russia could be relied upon to protect friendly regimes, further cementing its role as a global power. Russia's entry into the war dramatically altered the battlefield dynamics. Its airstrikes played a pivotal role in shifting the momentum in Assad's favor, targeting opposition-held areas, disrupting supply lines, and weakening rebel positions. In addition to air support, Russia provided military advisors, intelligence, and advanced weaponry to bolster Assad's forces. Although Russian troops were deployed on the ground in limited numbers, they played a crucial role in key operations. Russia also engaged in diplomatic efforts, presenting itself as a mediator in the conflict. Alongside Iran and Turkey, Moscow spearheaded the Astana peace talks, which aimed to establish ceasefires and negotiate a political resolution to the war. These efforts helped solidify Russia's role as a major power in the region. Despite Russia's military support, however, Assad's regime was far from invincible. On December 8, 2024, it finally collapsed as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and other rebel groups swiftly took control. Assad fled to Moscow, seeking refuge, while Russian forces began withdrawing from Syria. Now, Russia is engaged in negotiations to retain its military bases in the country, but its position is weakening. Putin, however, refuses to acknowledge this reality. In speeches and public statements, he insists that Russia's mission was successful, citing past military victories such as the recapture of Aleppo in 2016 and the defeat of ISIS in key areas. He argues that Russia prevented Syria from falling into complete anarchy, although the current situation suggests otherwise. Syria remains highly unstable, and its new rulers have no unified vision, making future conflict inevitable. Putin's denial serves multiple purposes. Domestically, it helps him maintain his image as a strong leader, particularly at a time when his authority is being questioned due to failures in Ukraine, economic struggles, and increasing dissent. Acknowledging a loss in Syria would undermine his credibility, which is already strained due to the costly and disastrous war with Ukraine. Financially, Russia's intervention in Syria was an immense burden, costing an estimated $4 billion annually for nearly a decade. Admitting failure would mean acknowledging that this massive expenditure was a waste, something Putin cannot afford politically. Instead, he frames the intervention as a necessary and successful investment in Russia's strategic interests. Furthermore, conceding defeat in Syria would weaken Russia's standing on the global stage. Putin wants to project strength and deter adversaries from perceiving Russia as vulnerable. This is especially critical as Russia continues to struggle in Ukraine, where it has suffered staggering military losses and economic sanctions that have isolated it internationally. Despite Putin's insistence on victory, the facts paint a different picture. Russia has been forced to retreat from Syria after nearly a decade of intervention, and its influence in the country is now in jeopardy. The rebels it sought to crush are now in power, and the humanitarian crisis remains dire, with millions of Syrians displaced and in need of aid. In the end, Russia's intervention prolonged the war rather than resolving it, leading to immense suffering without achieving lasting stability. No matter how Putin spins the story, the reality remains: Russia lost in Syria. The same pattern is playing out in Ukraine, where Putin continues to deny the extent of his failures. His refusal to acknowledge reality only extends the suffering of both Russians and those caught in the wars he has fueled. Ultimately, the legacy of his interventions in both Syria and Ukraine will be marked not by victory, but by costly miscalculations and humanitarian catastrophe.